So here's the problem. For whatever reason, Glock can't seem to create a subcompact pistol that will check all the boxes that their competitor subcompact pistols do. Here's what I mean by that. If we take the Glock 19, it's large enough so that you can use it for home defense. It carries enough rounds so you can actually have fun with it at the range, and yet it's still small enough for most people to conceal carry with it. But what if you're not most people and you find it a little bit too large to comfortably carry inside the waistband? Well, for those people, if they want something smaller, but they also want to stick with Glock, they can either go with the Glock 26 or the Glock 43X. But whenever someone switches from a 19 size pistol down to the Glock 26 or the Glock 43, all these trade-offs and problems arise that this pistol solves. This is the unofficial Glock 26X, and this is the pistol that, for whatever reason, Glock refuses to make. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because this solves the problems and the trade-offs between all the pistols we already mentioned. However, although this one solves a lot of the problems and trade-offs between all of those pistols, there are some very important things that you need to know about it, as well as pros and cons and potential problems that you can run into. You really need to know about before you decide to go out and one of these yourself, which we'll go into detail about further into the video. But to fully understand why I think the Glock 26X is a little bit better than the Glock 19 and much better than the Glock 43X and Glock 26, we need to cover the pros and cons. Let's start with the Glock 26. It is a lot smaller, making it a little bit easier for someone to concealed carry, but it comes with three major trade-offs from the Glock 19. Number one, the grip length. Obviously, you can see that this grip is pretty short, meaning you can only get your middle and ring finger onto the grip itself. That can make it very difficult for you to grip properly and mitigate recoil. And because the grip is so short, these are limited to 10 rounds. However, the Glock 26 does something that the Glock 43X definitely can't do. Because the Glock 26 is still a double stack pistol, it can actually share magazines from the Glock 19 and the Glock 17. Now, I totally understand that this looks really funny, but they actually make these sleeves that go around the OEM magazines that fill in that grip right there and makes it into a longer full-size grip. And if that's not the route that someone wanted to go, there's also different types of extensions that can be had. Like this little guy right here, it's just a pinky extension, your pinky a place. And then there's other stuff like this that can take this to almost the capacity of a Glock 19. Now, the grip and the capacity are only two out of the three problems. The third problem with the Glock 26 is that it doesn't have any type of light rail on here. And there are a couple of solutions for that. The only light that's really made for the Glock 26 is the Streamlight TLR6. It actually looks really good on the gun, but the downside is they're only 100 lumens. The battery life's not that great because they were created a long time ago, and there's just not any dedicated lights for this guy that are actually good. So if you're the kind of person that really wants to carry with a good light inside the waistband, you're a little bit SOL for most lights. Which actually reminds me, I will have a list for absolutely everything that we're talking about. I know I'm throwing a lot of different things at you. So if you're interested in that list, it'll be the first link in the description. I'll pin it in the comments section. And for those of you guys watching on TV, here's a QR for you. Feel free to scan that and scroll it while you watch the video. Now, all of those trade-offs and kind of issues that we had with the Glock 26 can seemingly be solved with the Glock 43X, specifically the Glock 43X MOS. With the original Glock 43X, they increased the length of the grip, giving it a 10+1 capacity. But it had a really long grip that allowed you to get all three fingers on there, and it really changed the shooting characteristics of the gun for the better. But then people said, well, we want a light. So then they came out with the MOS version, which added a tack rail to it. However, despite this solving all the problems that people had with the 26, it didn't really solve the capacity issue of the 26 because it carries the same amount of rounds. And so people had to resort to the aftermarket. And thankfully, there's 2 or 3 aftermarket companies that redesign magazines to carry a full 15 rounds on this, similar to the Glock 19. I'll have info about that stuff over at the parts list if you want to check it out. However, with that said, some people have complained that those aftermarket magazines for the Glock 43X aren't as reliable as OEM Glock. And I have tested the different ones that are available. I've had no issues personally, but some people have. So some people say, well, if I can't use OEM magazines and get the capacity I want, then I just want to skip it. The other downside to the Glock 43 is these are the only Glock pistols that can't share magazines of the same caliber, like I showed you with the Glock 26. The other downside to the Glock 43X especially when you compare it to their double stack counterparts, is it has really poor grip texture. It's a very slippery gun to hold. And unfortunately, because this gun is so lightweight and so small, it has very snappy recoil. And it's hard to mitigate that recoil when you have poor grip texture. And so as you can see, it kind of makes it a little bit of a tough choice. If the Glock 19 is a little bit too large for you, but the Glock 26 has a lot of trade-offs that you're not willing to go with, and then the Glock 43X has too many trade-offs, those are the problems that the Glock 26X solves. What's interesting is if you look at these two guns in an overlay, they are almost identical in size and footprint. The slide is barely any longer on the Glock 26, and the grip length is exactly the same, except this one can use all the different double stack Glock mags, has a 15+1 capacity out of the box without having to use aftermarket solutions. Smaller and lighter weight than a Glock 19, making it a little bit easier to conceal carry. And what makes this a little bit easier for someone to conceal carry? If you take a look at this holster right here, this holster is from a Glock 19. And if you look at the bottom here, the muzzle comes all the way to the end. Well, when you have this on in the appendix position, this muzzle is going to be poking you in the pelvis at a certain point. Whereas if you had a shorter holster with a shorter slide, when you go to sit down, it's more comfortable for you to conceal carry. This is essentially a double stack Glock 43X without all the trade-offs of the Glock 43X. But what's even better than that is it's actually not much heavier than a Glock 43X. It only weighs about 2.5 ounces more on my scale than the Glock 43X, which makes it a really good alternative. However, that still leaves a few questions unanswered. Number one, how do you go about putting one of these together and making sure it runs properly? Number two, how does it perform at the range? And number three, what about holster compatibility and lights that fit on these? Which reminds me of something that I forgot to mention earlier. If you guys could do me a huge favor, if you want to help out these videos, the biggest thing that you can do to help get these videos is to simply hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. I greatly appreciate it. So if someone wanted to build a Glock 26X, they essentially have two frame options. Number one is the Glock Store M1X. I'm pretty sure you've seen this pushed around social media and YouTube over the past year or so. It's the Glock Store version of the Glock 26X, or you can go with the one that I went with, which is the Nomad Defense 9SX. And we'll talk about here in a little bit why I chose this one over the Glock Store version, but first let's do a little bit of a comparison and contrast. Some people say the Nomad Defense is copying the Glock Store version, but if you actually go back and look at their social media posts from when all this stuff was released, these guys were about a month ahead of Glock Store. I don't think either one copied one another. I think they just kind of had the same idea around the same time because nobody could copy each other within a month's time frame. So the Glock Store M1X frame, it runs about $150 altogether. It comes in two colors. You can get it either in black or in coyote tan. It includes the mag release pre-installed, it includes the takedown lever, and it includes the Gen 5 ambidextrous slide stop slide release. As of right now, at the time of me recording this video, the Glock Store frame doesn't have any official mag wells available for it yet. However, some people on Reddit have stated that some of the aftermarket Gen 5 mag wells will fit it, but not all. So you'd have to go search Reddit to see which ones actually fit and stuff. It does have a light rail, very similar to the Nomad Defense frame. And on the Glock Store's website, they say that the only light that is compatible for it is the Streamlight TLR7 sub. Now on the Nomad 9SX, this one runs about 160. However, this one doesn't include any of the parts at that price point. That is for a complete stripped frame. So you don't get the mag release, you don't get the slide stop slide release, and you don't get the takedown lever like you do with the Glock Store version. However, they do offer a different version, which has the upgraded back strap right here that has more texture and a mag well, and those run about $220, which isn't half bad for a mag well, considering that most CNC aluminum mag wells are like 80 to 100. Now, this one comes in more colors than the Glock Store one. This one comes in black, gray, and flat dark earth. And for example of those colors, now although these aren't Glock 26X's, this is the gray one and this is the FDE one. And you could see like This is similar to the Coyote one that is available from Glock Store, even though this is OEM. So you can see the difference between Coyote and Flat Dark Earth, just for reference. Now, this one also has a light rail, as you saw earlier, but this one has far superior texture to the Glock Store model, which is the reason why I chose to go with this one instead of the Glock Store model. So if you look at the Glock Store model, the grip texture on it is very similar to that of OEM Glock, except it's a little bit more aggressive, but it only comes up to about right here and then it stops. They do have like these little accelerator cuts that are on the indexing points, but they don't have any texturing in them. And that's always been something that has bothered the crap out of me. Whereas when you look at the frame right here, you'll notice this one has very good indentation, textured thumb ledges right here, and they work really well at mitigating recoil. And the texture on the side goes up a little bit higher, and it is really good at mitigating recoil, which you'll see when we get to the range footage. I chose this one, but I'm pretty sure you can't go wrong with either one. But now we need to answer the question, how you actually put these together, because interesting thing about this, you know, over the years of doing YouTube, we've put together a ton of Glock builds, like over 30 or 40 over the past 9.5 years. And this one requires a little bit of extra knowledge to put it together, and I'm gonna explain that in detail. So there are essentially two ways to put one of these together. Number one, and the easiest way, is to start with a Gen 5 Glock 26. All you gotta do is swap all the parts over and it's good to go. Now, what if you have a Gen 4 Glock 26? Well, if you have a Gen 4, pretty much all of the parts are gonna swap over except for the takedown lever spring. I'll show you a photo and a comparison of them. On the Gen 5s, they switched from a leaf spring to a coil spring. That's the only part that won't swap over. They're only like a couple bones. I'll have info at the parts list on where to get those. Now, if you have a Gen 3 Glock 26, those will swap over as well. However, you're gonna need a few extra parts. In addition to getting that coiled spring for the takedown lever, you're also gonna need to get a Gen 4 or Gen 5 trigger housing. You'll also need to get the Gen 4 or Gen 5 magazine release right here, because the Gen 3s had a very small one and it won't swap over. Aside from that, they all swap over. Now here's the problem with this, okay? So as you guys know, Glock discontinued all of their Gen 5s and stuff back in, I think, November. The problem is you can't simply pick up a brand new Gen 5 Glock 26 anymore, or Gen 3 or Gen 4. They can only be had on the used market. However, Glock did reintroduce the Glock 26 as the V-line. The downside is because they redesigned the underside of the slide, the V-line slides will not work on Gen 5 frames. If you don't have a donor Glock 26, you can piece it together yourself. And this is where we really need to pay attention to the parts we're using. Let me show you this up close real quick. So when I was originally starting the Glock 26X, my original goal was to just buy a Gen 5 Glock 26 slide. The problem is, when I went to go find a Gen 5 26 slide, they cost the exact same amount as just getting a Glock 26 Gen 5 pistol. The second problem I ran into was there was no aftermarket Gen 5 Glock 26 slides that could be found. So if you're gonna put one of these together yourself, you can try searching for a Gen 5 slide, but you're probably not gonna have much luck. So you're gonna have to search out a Gen 3 or Gen 4 slide. And fortunately, between the Gen 3 and Gen 4 slides, they're virtually identical and they will work. And don't worry, over at the parts list, I'll have info about some of my favorite aftermarket slides for this. The ones that you see in front of you, I think the companies have gone out of business, have had them for years, but there are some newer ones that are really good that I do like. So all that will be at the parts list, as well as everything that we're gonna talk about in this section, because this is how you're gonna be able to put this together as problem-free as possible. Here's where it gets kind of interesting. The Glock 26 barrels, doesn't matter which generation, they will all work, Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5. No problems there. The one thing that you will need to get is this guy right here. I don't believe these are included with either the Glock Store frame or the Nomad frame, but this is a Glock 26 locking block. I'll have info for that, but that doesn't typically come with any of your lower parts kits and stuff like that. So definitely got to get one of those. And so if you do get lucky and you're going to run a Gen 5 slide, the cool thing about a Gen 5 slide is you can run either the ambidextrous slide stop slide release, or you can run the single one. If you're gonna run a Gen 5 slide, you can run either the Gen 5 trigger or you can run a Gen 4 trigger. If you get a Gen 3 or Gen 4 slide, you can't use the Gen 5 trigger housing back here. It has to be a Gen 4 trigger housing. So if you get a Gen 4 trigger housing, it doesn't matter if you have a Gen 3 or Gen 4 trigger bar, that's fine. So you need to use the Gen 3 or Gen 4 trigger. Because the Gen 3, Gen 4 slides do not have the ambidextrous cutouts for the slide, stop, slide release, you need to use the single side slide, stop, slide release. Because if you look at these two triggers, let me show you them up close real quick. This one right here is a Gen 5 trigger, and this one is a Gen 3, Gen 4. And the reason these won't work with the ambidextrous slide, stop, slide release is you'll notice that this one is narrower. And this the slide, stop, slide release has to fit around it, and the Gen 4, Gen 3 triggers is simply too large. If you're getting Gen 3, Gen 4 slides, you need to use a single slide, stop, slide release, Gen 4 trigger housing. Gen 3 won't work, and Gen 5 won't work with these slides. Gen 3 won't even fit in the frame, and then the Gen 5 trigger housings just won't work with these slides. The other thing, and I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about converting a Gen 4. So right here is a Gen 4 Glock 26. And this right here is our Glock 26X. This one has a leaf spring right there, and that is what actuate our takedown lever right here. Well, when they moved to Gen 5, they moved, and I don't know if we can see it, but you can kind of see it down in there. That is a coil spring. So you will need to get the coil spring as well. Now, my suggestion whenever you're gonna do something, any type of build, especially with Glocks, to use as many OEM internals as you can. Now, aftermarket internals don't mean that it's gonna mess up, but they can. You get a lot of tolerance stacking, and sometimes you can get tolerance stacking with OEM parts, but it's less likely to happen with OEM parts than it is with aftermarket parts. Now, with that said, there are some aftermarket companies that make Glock 26 lower parts kits. I'll have info at the parts list about them. The downside is you'll get the parts kit, but there's a couple of pieces you need to get. You need to have the Gen 4 magazine release, or Gen 5, it doesn't really matter. And that's because the old Gen 3s had these mag releases right here. Can't use those. So the parts, lower parts kits, they'll come with this one, but you'll need to get that one separately. They'll also come with the leaf spring for your takedown lever, and you'll need to get the coil spring. I'll have it all notated at the parts list for you. Slide parts, honestly, I haven't had any bad luck with any of the aftermarket slide parts, so you're good to go on that. But you just need all those, and you put it together, and then you have a Glock 26X. So now that we know what the problems it solves and we know how to actually put one of these together, all of that sounds great in theory, but how does this thing actually perform at the range? Well, at the range, when I was testing this, I didn't test it with this slide that's on it. I tested it in this configuration with the Streamlight TLR7 and the OEM Glock 26 Gen 5 slide. Whenever I'm testing things, I try to use as many OEM parts as possible to eliminate as many variables as possible in case problems arise. So when I first took it to the range, I tested it with factory new 115 grain Blazer brass ammo, and I used different magazines as well. I used it with Gen 3, Gen 4 mags, I tested it with Glock 19 Gen 5 magazines, and I tested it with Glock 19 Magpul P mags. And when I first got to the range, the first thing that I noticed was the recoil impulse. It actually feels a little bit softer than a standard Glock 19. And I think that's because of the shorter slide and there's less reciprocating mass. But when it's paired with this full-size grip, it just shoots really nicely. It was really easy to get double taps and triple taps, no problems at all. And I was just as fast and accurate with the Glock 26X as I am with my Glock 19. And for reference, in case you don't know, I tend to prefer Glock 19s. I don't know why, I just tend to be good with them. However, I did run into a couple of problems at the range in regards to reliability. Thankfully, there was only one reliability issue that I ran into. It was really annoying. Whenever I was testing this, I started getting premature slide lock, and that's where the slide locks open before you're out of ammo in the magazine. I started noticing that it was very picky about the magazines that I was using. So for example, with the Gen 3, Gen 4 mags, I didn't have any issues. With the Gen 5 magazines, it would sometimes get premature slide lock, and with the Magpul P mags, it would get slide lock multiple times in a single magazine. While I was at the range though, I did start Google searching, if other people had this issue, and I found a couple of guys on Reddit that had the same issue with this same exact frame. And here's where the problem lies. This frame was sent to me by the guys at Nomad Defense. When they sent it to me, it had all the lower parts already installed, meaning it was using their lower parts kit in their slide stop slide release. Essentially, all I had to do was swap out their ambidextrous slide release with an OEM one, and it solved all the problems. A couple of guys on Reddit said that they needed to swap out the locking block that came from Nomad Defense with an OEM locking block, and that solved the problem. But I noticed once I swapped it out for the OEM slide lock slide release, and then I also tested it with a single slide stop slide release, all those reliability issues went away. And that's why I was talking about earlier when we were up close, the importance of using OEM parts, as many as possible. My main criticism, however, with this frame has nothing to do with the way it shoots or anything. It has to do with how much the mag release button protrudes on the support hand side. I'll throw some B-roll footage of it up close, but if you look at a Gen 5 Glock, the magazine is a little bit flush with the frame, and it's also not difficult for me to reach. Well, when you look at the one on the Nomad Defense, this magazine release button protrudes out a little bit further than the frame. And the thing that bothers me about that is I keep catching the flesh of my support hand on the top corner of that magazine release button, and it's really annoying. For me, I don't like extended controls on any pistol. I don't like extended slide stop slide releases because I tend to accidentally hit them. And then I don't like extended mag releases because whenever I'm shooting, the flesh of my hand will hit it and I'll drop magazines while I'm shooting, and it's super annoying. But that's my only problem with this frame so far. But that brings me to my next question. Why won't Glock simply create a Glock 26X? My theory is this. I think that it's so close to a Glock 19 that people will be like, what's the point? And I think that people that want the Glock 26 are gonna be like, what's the point? I could just get a 19. But I think the main people that would like this are people that like Glock 43Xs. I'm just assuming that Glock has so much money invested in their current lineup that they don't wanna put another one in there where it would make the other ones not sell as well. That's my theory, I don't know. Now we need to cover the question, what about holsters and lights and holster and light combos? Basically, if you have any Glock 26 holster or Glock 19 holster that's not made for a light, it fits no problem, at least on this frame. I can't speak for the Glock store frame because it's a little bit different, but no issues at all. The problem kind of comes when we talk about light bearing holsters. And there are a couple of companies that I am aware of, and I'll have info about them over at the parts list, that are actually molding holsters for the Nomad Defense frames with a light. However, the reason I bring that up is none of your Glock 19 light bearing holsters are going to fit this. Because if you look at the bottom side of this, you'll notice that the light rail on the Glock 26X frame is pushed a little bit further back than the Glock 19 frame. And because of that, you won't be able to get a good fit using this guy in a Glock 19 holster molded for a light. Now, the interesting thing about light compatibility with these frames though, is on the Glock Store website, it says they only work with the Streamlight TLR7 sub. Well, on the Nomad Defense website, they say not only will it fit the Streamlight, but it'll fit the Surefire XSC B Universal. I've never used that light, I don't know. It'll also fit the Olight PL Mini Valkyrie 2. And they said it would also fit the Enforce Wild 1. And if you guys don't know, that is my favorite weapon light for concealed carry. I like the flush fit of it. The downside is I have one of those lights, but I can't test it on here because it comes with different inserts, and I only had the insert for my Glock that I carry, and I've lost the box to it. I don't know for sure if the Wild 1 fits, but that's what they said on their website. Now, if this is something that you're like, okay, that's cool, but I'm not really super interested in it, I still want something that is slimmer, then I highly recommend you go check out this video right here, because this is a slim profile build that I did, and I think if you don't like this and you don't like the Glock 43X, you'll love this. But until next time, I love you. You guys stay sexy.